always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads, just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off-trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof. The same open door. The same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler. Normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike in took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness? Barefoot? That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor. Barefoot. Dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it. That awful, crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror. a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours' walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight, just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break, but by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind. Just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough. The branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again, a sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind. But something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. There's something about hiking alone at night that makes the world feel different. The trails I walk during the day, the ones I know like the back of my hand, take on a different personality after dark. The trees seem taller, their shadows deeper. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind shifting through the branches, stand out more. Even the dirt beneath my boots feels softer, quieter. I've always preferred hiking at odd hours. It started as a way to clear my head, a way to escape the noise of town. The woods around here are vast, spreading out in all directions, cutting through neighborhoods and stretching far beyond the highways. Some of the trails are well maintained, others barely used. I like to push deep into the lesser-known areas, the ones where you can walk for miles without seeing another person. There's something peaceful about it. Walking in the dark, knowing that most of the world is asleep while you're out there with nothing but the sound of your own breath and the rustling trees. Some nights, I hike so late that I end up watching the sunrise from deep in the woods. It's a sight that never gets old. How the darkness slowly melts into soft blues and oranges, how the first light filters through the leaves. It makes the long hikes worth it. But one night, I found something that made me rethink my whole routine. It was past midnight when I set out, later than usual. The air was cool, the kind of early autumn chill that makes your breath fog up just slightly. I had a good flashlight with me, but I preferred not to use it unless I had to. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and the moon was bright enough to guide me. I took one of the lesser-used trails, the kind that isn't marked on any official map but exists because enough people have walked it over the years. The dirt path twisted through the trees, cutting across a dry creek bed before climbing a gentle hill. I had been walking for over an hour when I spotted something unusual through the trees. A dim glow, just barely visible between the branches. I wasn't expecting to see a fire this deep in the woods. Campfires weren't unheard of out here, but they were rare, especially this far off the main trails. Most people who camped in these woods stuck to the designated areas closer to town. This was different. It wasn't just a fire. It was low to the ground, flickering unevenly, like it was burning in something unusual. Curiosity got the best of me. I stepped off the trail and moved toward the light, careful with my footing. The last thing I wanted was to snap a branch underfoot and announce my presence before I knew what I was walking into. As I got closer, I started to make out shapes. Structures, small ones, huddled together in a rough circle. They weren't tents. They weren't even real shelters. They looked like makeshift huts, pieced together from whatever scraps someone could find. Metal sheets, tarps, bed sheets strung up on sticks. Some of them barely stood taller than my waist. Others looked big enough for a person to crawl into. It was a shantytown right in the middle of the woods. The fire sat in the center of it all, burning inside the hollowed-out frame of an old tire. The rubber had burned away, leaving just the metal skeleton, blackened and misshapen from the heat. The flames flickered weakly, casting just enough light to see by. But there was no one there. That was the part that didn't make sense. The fire was still burning, but the whole place was silent. I stood still, listening, not just to the woods, but to the camp itself. If people were here, they were staying unnervingly quiet. No voices, no movement inside the shelters. Nothing. I took a slow step closer, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The structures weren't abandoned, not completely. There were things left behind. A pile of clothes next to one of the huts. A plastic grocery bag filled with canned food. An old radio with a cracked speaker. Someone had been living here. Recently, I should have turned back. I knew that even then, this wasn't my place. Whatever this was, whoever had built this, they clearly didn't want to be found. But something about the whole scene felt wrong. Why was the fire still burning? Why had they left it like that? I looked around, scanning the ground for footprints, for any sign of movement. The dirt near the fire was disturbed, but I couldn't tell how fresh the tracks were. They could have been made an hour ago. They could have been from earlier in the day. I took a few more steps, just enough to get a better look at the shelters. Up close, they looked even more fragile, held together with rope and duct tape. Some of them had pieces of furniture inside, old chairs, a small table with a broken leg, a foam mattress pad half covered with a sleeping bag. Still no people. That was when I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It crept over me slow, like a chill working its way up my spine. I've spent enough time in the woods to trust my gut when it tells me something is wrong. And right then, it was screaming at me. I wasn't alone. The realization sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my body. My breathing slowed, my ears straining for any sound, any shift in the air. But there was nothing. Whoever had been here hadn't just walked away from their camp. They were still here, watching me. I didn't move, didn't turn my head. I just stood there, staring at the fire, listening. The woods were too quiet. No insects, no wind through the trees. Just silence. Then finally I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A footstep somewhere behind me. Not an animal. Not the sound of a branch falling or a leaf shifting. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. And then another. I turned and left. Not running, not panicking. Just walking, steady and controlled. Back the way I had come. My body was tense, waiting for the sound of movement behind me, waiting for whoever was out there to step into view. But they never did. I walked until the firelight faded behind me, until the woods swallowed it completely. Then, and only then, did I pick up my pace. My heart was hammering, my senses on high alert. I kept expecting to hear footsteps rushing up behind me, to feel a hand grabbing my shoulder. But nothing came. By the time I reached the main trail, the sun was starting to rise. The first light of morning cut through the trees, chasing away the shadows. I didn't stop walking until I was out of the woods completely. I never went back to that part of the forest again, and I never hiked at night after that. I was younger, dumber, and way too confident in myself back in college. It was the early 2000s, and I was studying in the North Georgia mountains, a place where nature felt like it stretched on forever. Small towns, thick forests, quiet roads that wound up into the hills like veins. The campus was close to a lot of hiking trails, some official, some just well-worn paths cutting through the woods. My friends and I used to go night hiking all the time, just for fun, for the thrill of being out there in the dark, moving through the trees like we belonged to the wilderness. Over time, I got too comfortable, too familiar. I started thinking I knew these woods better than I did, that there was nothing out there that could surprise me. One night, I learned how wrong I was. It was one of those nights where the air felt perfect, cool but not cold, with a full moon so bright that everything was bathed in a pale, washed-out blue. I had been hanging out in my dorm, a little stoned but still sharp enough to know my surroundings, and I got the urge to go hiking alone. It wasn't my first time doing a solo night hike. I liked being by myself, liked the quiet, liked how different the world felt when there was no one around. I grabbed a flashlight, stuffed it into my jacket pocket, and set out. The trail I chose as an easy one, maybe a mile loop, mostly flat, cutting through a heavily wooded area a few miles from campus. It wasn't a national park or anything, just a section of forest that stretched between the back roads. There weren't a lot of houses out that way, just occasional clearings with old barns or driveways leading off into the trees. I had hiked it dozens of times, both during the day and at night. I knew every curve, every route, every low-hanging branch. As I walked, I kept my flashlight off. I didn't need it. The moon was so bright that I could see the dirt path clearly, could make out the leaves on the trees and the rocks along the way. The whole forest felt alive with detail, but in a muted, dreamlike way. It was beautiful. For a while, everything was perfect. Then I felt it, that shift, that slow, creeping awareness that something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a tightening in my stomach, a vague unease, like stepping onto a bridge and feeling it sway under your feet. I slowed my pace, listening to the woods around me. Nothing had changed, not really. The night insects were still chirping, the leaves still rustling in the wind, but something felt off. And then I heard it. A man's voice, crying, came from ahead of me, somewhere to the right of the trail, deeper in the woods. It wasn't just quiet sobbing. It was raw, almost animalistic, like someone had been crying for hours and was on the verge of breaking apart completely. There was the strange quality to it, a thin, sharp sound beneath the sobs, like he was constantly holding back a scream. I stopped dead in my tracks. I should have turned back right then. I know that now, but in that moment, my brain hesitated, split between fear and concern. If you hear someone crying in the middle of the woods at night, your first instinct should be to get away. But my mind kept trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe someone was hurt. Maybe they had gotten lost. Maybe they were drunk or high and didn't know where they were. I almost called out. Almost. My throat tightened, and before I could force the words out, my body shut down. Some instinct buried deep in my bones told me that speaking was the worst possible thing I could do. I stayed silent. I didn't move. The crying went on, uninterrupted, like whoever it was had no idea I was there. But the longer I stood there, the worse the sound became. It wasn't just grief, it was broken, almost like a child wailing after something unspeakable, but in a voice that was too deep, too ragged. And that shrillness under it, that barely restrained scream, made my stomach twist in a way I can't fully describe. I backed up slowly, one step, then another. The crying didn't change. It didn't get louder, didn't stop. That should have made me feel better. But it didn't, because if he wasn't reacting to me, that meant he hadn't seen me yet. Which also meant that if I wasn't careful, that could change. I turned and started walking back the way I came, forcing myself to move as quietly as possible. Every sound felt deafening. The scrape of my boot on the dirt, the rustle of leaves, my own breathing. I kept waiting for the crying to shift, for it to suddenly cut off, for footsteps to come crashing toward me through the trees. But it never did. The crying just stayed where it was, hovering in the air like a razor-thin wire stretched to its breaking point. It wasn't until I had put real distance between myself and the sound that the panic fully set in. My hands were shaking. My jaw was clenched so tight that my teeth ached. The moment I saw my car, sitting there like a beacon at the trailhead, I felt like I was seconds away from losing it completely. I half expected to hear footsteps rushing up behind me as I unlocked the door. Some wild-eyed figure sprinting out of the trees, face twisted, mouth open in a silent scream. Nothing happened. I got in, slammed the door shut, locked it. My breathing was fast, ragged. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I didn't even start the car right away. I just sat there, trying to force my body to calm down, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of something terrible. Even then, I didn't feel safe, because for all I knew, he was still out there, crying in the dark. I never went back to that trail at night. I never hiked alone in the dark again, period. For years, I tried to tell myself that maybe it had been a guy having a breakdown. Maybe he was high or grieving or lost. But deep down, I don't believe that. Something was wrong with him. Something was deeply, fundamentally broken. And the worst part, the part that still makes my skin crawl even now, is knowing how close I came to making myself known to him. If the moon had been less bright, if I had used my flashlight even once, he would have seen me for sure. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. "No one really goes up that way," he had said. "Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none, just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing.